So I have to admit something. I thought that I was going to be ready with the presentation over the weekend and gather the data, and I will be done with that. Now, I was, but then I woke up Monday morning, and half of Ukraine was ruined. Most of the infrastructure was bombed, shelled, and the situation changed. This is how volatile the situation is. This is how uncertain everything at the moment. In early September, when we were in Ukraine with Krzysztof, we traveled to Lviv, Kiev, and Odessa Oblast. And that time we faced the genuine fear of people, government officials, and church organizations that Russia made or would actually destroy the energy infrastructure to disable and cripple Ukraine and actually put more pressure on Europe. And this is what happened when I woke up on Monday morning. Meanwhile, we were also informed that the central government asked church organizations and other NGOs to formulate Plan B in case of partial or full halt of the the provided energy by the central government. We were there. This is a full neighborhood, what you can see, and this is where the Russians came into the city and they destroyed everything what they could see. And perhaps this is what we can see again in Ukraine after Monday's and Tuesday's shellings. As we have seen it on Monday, and I'm sure you've seen it on the news as well, and Tuesday, that fear of the Ukrainians was not unfounded. As of last week, before that shelling, 50% of electricity generation was either destroyed, damaged, or occupied. According to Ukraine's energy minister Herman Halushenko, Russia hit about 30% of Ukraine's remaining energy infrastructure, bless you, in its missile attack on Monday and Tuesday. That is additional on the 50% that was previously ruined, occupied, or just partially damaged. Ukraine also urged civilians on Tuesday not to use domestic appliances like ovens, washing machines, to save electricity as millions faced blackouts. Businesses were also asked to cut down on usage. Now, I would like to remind you that there are also territories in Ukraine that are just recently liberated. There is no electricity and no heating over there. These are additional problems that will come on top. And also there are territories, so-called red zones, where you can find active fighting, which is also lacking electricity and heating and other infrastructures. The IDP hub that Krzysztof was talking about, the westernmost biggest city, Lviv, infrastructure was one of the hardest hit. You can see it's on the left-hand side, which is pretty close to the Polish border. That's why internal refugees, IDPs, were seeking refuge there. That was supposed to be the safest city, or the safest oblast. In most cities, power was restored in 24 hours. However, as of this morning, there were parts of the attacked cities where heating and electricity was still out. The temperature at the moment in Ukraine ranges between the high 40s and low 50s. Here you can see the energy infrastructure of Ukraine. And if I go back to the previous one and you compare it, you can see these are pretty much the same cities that were shelled. So that's intentional. Ukraine was going to be crippled, and that was the intention of Russia. These are the damaged infrastructures on the left-hand side. You can see it's not a new tactic from Russia that they are targeting the infrastructure. And on the right-hand side, you can see the new result. But it was not always like that. At the beginning of this year, before the war, the Ukrainian energy sector was one of the most developed in Europe. Ukraine had one of the largest electricity generation capacities, was among the top 3 natural gas producers, and had the largest underground gas storage in Europe. Ukraine was second only to France in Europe when it comes to the amount of power that the country generates from nuclear energy. It provided more than half of the country's electricity in 2021. However, Zaporozhye, the nuclear plant, I'm sure you have heard about it, which is the largest in the continent, is now shut down. Before Monday's attack, the remaining plants in the country were responsible for about 35% of power generation, but are under constant assault. According to the latest government figures, Ukraine has accumulated approximately 2.2 million tons, which is about 24.2 million US tons of coal and 13.5 million BCM of natural gas, which is needed for central heating and electricity generation, which was going to be actually enough for Ukraine to survive the winter, given the 35% decline in consumption due to the outflow of population and the slump in industrial production. Not only enough, but President Zelensky announced in June that Ukraine began exporting electricity to the EU using an interconnection with Romania, starting with 100 megawatts. Also was hoping to bring 1.45 billion from electricity exports to the EU. This was a major step toward reducing Ukraine and actually Europe's reliance on Russian energy imports. Far-reaching wartime reforms, including totally reconnecting its energy to the grid, to Europe at the record speed ever. Actually, it was connected just like 1 day before the war broke out. Never happened before. Proper testing was not implemented because the Russians were already at the doors. Meanwhile, and by that, Ukraine could have, yes, I have to say, could have maintained vital energy output while a reliable network of oil and natural gas pipelines had ensured consistent fuel delivery. Additionally, active war was mainly pushed back to the eastern regions, implying that the capital, Kiev, and the western oblasts are relatively safe. Now, that was Sunday. And then Monday happened and everything changed. So until the critical infrastructures weren't targeted by the missiles. Monday strikes hit the thermal generation and the electrical substations that forced Ukraine to suspend electricity exports from the 11th of October, which is Tuesday, I guess, to stabilize its own energy system, which is absolutely understandable. Therefore, the EU member states will have to face additional decrease in import. In the largest attack carried out on Ukrainian energy grid since the early days of the invasion, missiles tore into electricity and heating plants across 10 cities. Lviv, Khmelnytsky, Zhytomyr, Kharkiv, they were left completely without electricity and heating. Attacks, however, continued on Tuesday as well, when Russia kamikaze drones just struck on another thermal power plant in Vinnytsia. Later, on Tuesday again, Russia kidnapped the deputy head of Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, detaining him in an unknown location. This is again another problem that Europe and actually everybody or all the nations across the globe has to face, the nuclear threat of Russia. Nevertheless, the greatest challenges lie ahead as the impending winter will tighten the noose on Ukraine and challenge Europe's politicians. Now, why these cities? I have already mentioned that if we put together the two maps, these just cover each other. But the system in Europe and in Ukraine is slightly different from the United States. Russia, however, deliberately wants to freeze Ukraine and the European Union as well. On average, in Ukraine, 45% of the buildings are connected to the central heating system, to which the heat is supplied from two main types of facilities. The first one is the combined heat and power plant that is designed to produce heat and electricity simultaneously. The second one is to the heat plants. While both mainly rely on natural gas, and that's why it was so important that before the war, actually, Ukraine was able to provide its own natural gas, and it has got Europe's biggest storage as well. And that was important before Monday, because it doesn't exist now. And also, there are smaller thermal power plants are scattered all around these cities. Now, the highest share of residential buildings equipped with central heating facilities are Zaporizhzhia, Donetsk, Dnipropetrovsk, Kharkiv Oblast, and Kyiv cities. You could see on the map that these were the cities that were the hardest hit. These cities also reliant on the central heating system from 55 to 89%. So they are very reliant. Whenever these infrastructures are done, these cities are going to be out of power, without electricity, without heat, without anything. And we are talking about mostly not high-rises like here, but what you could have seen on the pictures, what we both showed with Krzysztof. So it's not possible to set up gas burners in the middle of the apartment. So they are just going to be out with no electricity at all. And these cities and these infrastructures were intentionally targeted. Weaponization of energy and keeping the chokehold both on Ukraine and therefore on Europe has severe implications. The first one is, with the severe damage to the energy infrastructure, the country faces blackouts and difficulties in heating, just as I explained. The red zones are a little bit different because active fight is going on there. There is no heat, no electricity, there is nothing over there. The rural areas are especially vulnerable because they are just cut out of everything. The cities are vulnerable as well, but for different reasons, as I explained, because when the critical infrastructures are targeted and they are down, these cities are going to be out of energy. Ukraine traditionally faces harsh winter. Actually, the first snow has already arrived to the easternmost part of Ukraine, and that's why winterization is going to be really crucial at this time. However, it is going to face way more difficulties than before Monday. Giving out blankets, warm clothes, generators, and setting up hotspots, and I'm not talking about internet, in community centers and cities is going to be crucial. In rural areas, there is going to be a huge difference because these community centers, it's just going to be one room that is a hotspot. But in rural areas, there are no such centers. So what the international NGOs are planning to do, and actually they are doing it now, like every 5 to 10 houses, they're going to insulate one room that is going to be enough for all that 5-10 houses, and they are going to heat that up. It's possible to do that because they can have these small burners and it can warm it up. And also don't forget that they can cook on those little burners as well, what you can buy in any stores when you go to camping. This is in high demand, actually, in Ukraine. However, as Christoph mentioned it, depleting aid to local organizations is a huge problem. Yes. The looming nuclear strike, the energy shortage, and the uncertainty of shellings in the previously safe areas are potentially trigger another wave of refugees to Europe. The situation is quite severe and volatile, as I mentioned. It can change any day. There could be another shelling. There could be another missile strike on the remaining infrastructure, and it doesn't matter how hard the Ukrainian government and local NGOs are trying to repair those infrastructures. That is possible. Obviously, information is hard to get. I was trying to get information on the shelling that happened on Monday and Tuesday, but for understandable reasons and for strategic reasons, they don't want to give out the information and provide extra information to the Russians that which grids, which infrastructure is severely damaged and which are not. So we don't have exact data on that. The economies of the EU member states are on the rocks, as I'm sure you've heard about it. And the question where the EU is going to find the millions to host refugees when it happens. Amid inflation, skyrocketing prices, and mandatory demand destruction is also a problem in Europe. That is going to be an issue. Hosting and integrating Ukrainian refugees could cost host nations an estimated $30 billion in this year alone. Thank you so much for your attention.